The morning sun cast long shadows across the 43rd Precinct's parking lot as Officer Mike Sullivan pulled up in his worn-out Ford. He was early, as usual, a habit from his 20 years on the force. The facade of the brick building looked the same as it had for the past 2 decades, but today felt different. Change was coming, and Mike Sullivan hated change. He slammed his car door harder than necessary, causing a few pigeons to scatter from their perch on the building's ledge. His heavy boots echoed against the concrete as he made his way inside, carrying his usual black coffee from Joe's Diner around the corner. The familiar smell of stale coffee and printer ink greeted him as he pushed through the precinct's double doors. "Morning, Sullivan," called out Officer Jenny Martinez from the front desk. He barely nodded in response. 20 years ago, when he'd started, there hadn't been any female officers in this precinct. Now they were everywhere, and word was their new captain would be one too. Not just any female captain, an Asian one. The break room was mercifully empty when he entered. Sullivan took his usual seat, the one with the view of both entrances. Old habits died hard, and 2 decades of police work had taught him never to sit with his back to a door. He pulled out yesterday's newspaper, pretending to read while his mind wandered to the rumors about Captain Sarah Chen. "Did you hear she graduated top of her class at the academy?" Officer Thompson's voice drifted in from the hallway, and she turned around the 39th precinct in just 18 months. "Yeah, well, the 39th isn't the 43rd. Sullivan muttered to himself, taking an angry sip of his coffee. This was his precinct. They didn't need some outsider coming in and changing things up. Especially not some diversity hire who'd probably never worked a real beat in her life. The usual morning bustle began to fill the building. Officers shuffled in for the morning briefing, their radios crackling with early calls. Sullivan watched as his younger colleagues chatted excitedly about their new captain. Even his partner of 5 years, Davis, seemed optimistic. "Come on, Sully," Davis said, dropping into the chair next to him. "Give her a chance. Times are changing, man." Sullivan folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness. 20 years, Davis. 20 years I've kept these streets safe doing things the old way. The way that works. Now they're sending in someone who's gonna tell us we need to be more sensitive. More community-oriented. He spat the words like they left a bad taste in his mouth. The room fell silent suddenly, and Sullivan knew without turning around that she had arrived. He could feel Davis tensing beside him, but Sullivan took his time before looking up. When he did, he saw Captain Sarah Chen standing in the doorway, her presence commanding attention despite her small frame. She wore her dark hair in a neat bun, her captain's uniform pressed and perfect. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, every face. When her gaze met Sullivan's, he saw something there that surprised him, not uncertainty or challenge, but calm confidence. "Good morning, officers," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm Captain Chen. I know change can be uncomfortable, but I'm not here to turn your world upside down. I'm here because this precinct has potential to be even better than it already is." Sullivan watched as she moved through the room, shaking hands, learning names. She didn't avoid him or single him out. When she reached his table, she extended her hand just as she had to everyone else. "Officer Sullivan," she said, surprising him by knowing his name. 20 years on the force, highest arrest record in the precinct, and more commendations than anyone else here. I've read your file. Impressive work." Sullivan stood slowly, aware of every eye in the room on him. He looked at her outstretched hand for a moment that stretched just a bit too long. Finally, he took it, giving a brief, firm shake. "Captain," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. As she moved on to the next table, Sullivan sat back down, his coffee now cold. Something in his gut told him that everything was about to change, whether he liked it or not. And Mike Sullivan definitely didn't like it. A week had passed since Captain Chen's arrival, and Sullivan sat in the precinct's main conference room, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The morning briefing had turned into what Chen called a strategic planning session, and Sullivan couldn't help but roll his eyes at the PowerPoint presentation displayed on the wall. "Our new community outreach program will include regular foot patrols, weekly meetings with local business owners, and youth engagement initiatives," Captain Chen explained, clicking to the next slide. The room was warm with too many bodies packed together, but Sullivan felt a cold anger building in his stomach. He watched his fellow officers nodding along like sheep. Even Davis, his old partner, was taking notes. Sullivan had seen programs like this come and go over his 20 years. They all ended the same way, with good officers getting hurt because they were too busy trying to be social workers instead of cops. "This is garbage," Sullivan muttered, loud enough for nearby officers to hear. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Captain Chen paused, her laser pointer hovering over a graph showing crime statistics. "Do you have something to add, Officer Sullivan?" The room fell silent. Sullivan uncrossed his arms and leaned forward in his chair. "Yeah, I do, Captain." He didn't try to hide the sarcasm in his voice when he said her title. "These fancy programs look great on paper, but they put officers at risk. We need to be tough on crime, not holding hands with criminals." Officer Martinez, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned to glare at him, but Sullivan wasn't done. "We've kept this neighborhood safe by showing strength. The minute we go soft, everything we've worked for goes down the drain. These people only understand one thing, force." "These people?" Chen's voice was quiet but clear. "Who exactly do you mean by these people, Officer Sullivan?" The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Sullivan felt sweat forming on the back of his neck, but he didn't back down. "You know exactly what I mean. The gangs, the dealers, the troublemakers. They're not going to change because we show up with basketball games and cookie-cutter programs." Captain Chen set down her laser pointer and walked to the center of the room. Her small frame somehow seemed to fill the space. "Officer Sullivan, please stay after the briefing. Everyone else, please review the new patrol assignments posted by Officer Martinez." Dismissed. As chairs scraped and officers filed out, many avoiding eye contact with Sullivan, he remained seated. He could feel Davis hesitate by the door, but his partner left without a word. Once the room was empty except for the two of them, Chen pulled up a chair and sat directly across from Sullivan. She didn't speak immediately, instead opening a folder she brought with her. "Do you know what these numbers represent?" she asked, sliding a paper across the table. Sullivan glanced at the document. It was full of statistics and graphs. "These are from my previous precinct," Chen continued, not waiting for his response. "Before we implemented community programs, we had 8 officers injured in the line of duty in 1 year. After the programs, that number dropped to 1. Response times improved by 40%. Violent crime dropped by 35%. Numbers can be made to say anything," Sullivan countered, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Chen pulled out another document. "This is your record, Sullivan. Impressive arrests, but also the highest number of civilian complaints in the precinct. The highest use of force incidents, the lowest community cooperation rates." Sullivan felt his face growing hot. "I get results." "You get arrests," Chen corrected. "But at what cost? To the community, to yourself." She leaned forward. "I've read every complaint, every report. You're a good cop, Sullivan, but you're fighting a war that doesn't need to exist." "With all due respect, Captain," Sullivan said, standing up, "you don't know this neighborhood like I do." "You're right," Chen replied, remaining seated. "I don't know it like you do, but maybe that's exactly why we need to change our approach. Unless you think the way things are is working perfectly." Sullivan stood there for a moment, the weight of 20 years pressing down on his shoulders. Without answering, he turned and walked toward the door. "Officer Sullivan," Chen called after him, "your new assignment starts tomorrow. You'll be walking a beat with Officer Washington. I suggest you get some comfortable shoes." Sullivan's hand tightened on the doorknob. Walking beats were for rookies, not veteran officers. And Washington, the new kid? This was a deliberate insult, and they both knew it. But as he pulled the door open, Chen's voice followed him one last time. "Sometimes the hardest thing to change isn't the neighborhood, Sullivan. It's ourselves." Officer Marcus Washington stood waiting at the corner of Maple and 5th, checking his watch for the 3rd time. It was 7:55 a.m., and Sullivan was supposed to meet him at 8 o'clock for their first walking beat together. The morning was cool, and the neighborhood was starting to wake up. Shop owners pulled up their metal shutters, and early commuters hurried to the bus stop. Washington, fresh out of the academy just 6 months ago, felt his stomach tighten when he saw Sullivan's car approaching. Everyone in the precinct knew about Sullivan's reputation, and yesterday's confrontation with Captain Chen was already legendary among the younger officers. Sullivan parked and stepped out, wearing his usual scowl. His usual polished shoes had been replaced with tactical boots, apparently his idea of comfortable shoes, as Captain Chen had suggested. "Morning, Officer Sullivan," Washington said, trying to keep his voice professional and friendly. Sullivan grunted in response, checking his gear belt for the third time. "Let's get this waste of time over with." They began their walk down Maple Street, past Maria's grocery where the old Hispanic lady was setting up her fruit display. She waved at Washington, who smiled and waved back. "You know her?" Sullivan asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Yeah, that's Maria. She makes the best tamales in the city. Her grandson just got accepted to college, first in the family." Sullivan said nothing, but Washington noticed him glancing back at the store. As they turned onto Oak Avenue, they passed the local high school. Groups of teenagers were starting to arrive, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Several of them called out, "Hey, Officer Washington." "You seem to know a lot of people," Sullivan said, his tone somewhere between accusation and curiosity. Washington nodded. "My mom taught at this school for 20 years. Plus, I grew up just 3 blocks from here." This made Sullivan stop in his tracks. "You're from this neighborhood?" "Sure am. Used to cause some trouble myself as a kid. That's actually why I became a cop. Wanted to give back, you know." They continued walking, the morning sun now warming their backs. Sullivan watched as Washington greeted more people, Mr. Chen at the laundromat, old Mr. Johnson sweeping his barbershop sidewalk, the kids at the bus stop. At the corner of Pine Street, they heard shouting coming from ahead. 2 young men were arguing loudly outside the convenience store. Sullivan immediately reached for his belt, but Washington held up a hand. "Let me handle this," Washington said, already walking forward. "Hey, Marcus. Jerome. What's going on?" The 2 young men turned, their angry expressions softening slightly at the sight of Washington. "Officer Mike," one of them said. Washington insisted kids called him by his first name. "Jerome here thinks he can just cut in line and take the last breakfast sandwich." Sullivan watched, hand still near his belt, as Washington laughed and pulled out his wallet. "How about this? I'll buy 2 more sandwiches, and you both help me clean up the graffiti I saw on the community center wall later." The young men looked at each other, then grinned. "Deal," they said almost simultaneously. As they walked away, sandwiches in hand, Sullivan shook his head. "You just rewarded bad behavior." "No," Washington corrected. "I just turned a potential fight into a community service opportunity. Those kids aren't bad, Sullivan. They just need someone to show them there's a better way." They continued their patrol, and Sullivan found himself noticing things he'd never seen from his patrol car. The way the crossing guard knew every child's name, how the local shop owners looked out for each other, the sense of community that existed beneath the surface he'd always seen as hostile. Near the end of their shift, they stopped at Maria's grocery for water. The old lady insisted on giving them both tamales, refusing payment. "For keeping us safe," she said, smiling warmly. As they sat on a nearby bench eating, Sullivan spoke up. "You know, Washington, maybe this beat isn't completely useless." Washington hid his smile behind his tamale. "High praise coming from you, Officer Sullivan." "Don't push it, rookie," Sullivan growled, but there was less edge to his voice than before. As they walked back to their starting point, both officers noticed more than just the usual signs of crime they were trained to look for. They saw the neighborhood, really saw it, with its struggles and its strengths, its problems and its promise. "Same time tomorrow?" Washington asked as they prepared to part ways. Sullivan looked at his comfortable new boots, then at the neighborhood around him. "Yeah," he said finally, "same time tomorrow." 2 weeks into their walking beat assignment, Sullivan and Washington were patrolling their usual route when the call came over their radios. 10 to 16, domestic disturbance at 247 Cedar Street, apartment 3B. Any units in the area please respond. Sullivan's hand instinctively moved to his radio. Cedar Street was in their sector, just 2 blocks away, but before he could respond, memories of a similar call from 5 years ago flashed through his mind, one that had ended with a civilian in the hospital and a complaint on his record. Washington was already responding to dispatch. Officers Sullivan and Washington responding, 2 minutes out. They jogged to the address, a worn-down apartment building with peeling paint. As they climbed the stairs, they could hear shouting from above, a woman's voice, then a man's angry response, followed by something breaking. Sullivan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. "I'll take point," he said, reaching for his weapon. "Wait," Washington said quietly, placing a hand on Sullivan's arm. "Let me try something first." Sullivan wanted to argue. This was exactly the kind of soft approach that got officers hurt. But something in Washington's expression made him hesitate. Washington knocked on the door. "Police department. Mr. Lee? Mrs. Lee? Is everything okay in there?" The shouting stopped. Sullivan tensed, ready for anything. How do you know our names?" A male voice called from inside. "It's Officer Mike, sir. Your daughter Jenny is in my youth basketball program. Is everyone safe in there?" There was a pause, then shuffling sounds. The door opened slightly, revealing a middle-aged Asian man with red-rimmed eyes. Behind him, a woman sat on the couch, wiping her tears. "Can we come in and talk?" Washington asked gently. "Maybe we can help." Mr. Lee looked at Sullivan, then back at Washington, before opening the door wider. The apartment was small but neat, except for a broken vase on the floor. Sullivan stayed near the door, watching as Washington sat down at the kitchen table with Mr. Lee, while Mrs. Lee made tea with shaking hands. "I lost my job today," Mr. Lee explained, his voice breaking. 23 years at the factory, and they just replaced me with machines. I didn't know how to tell her." He gestured toward his wife. "You didn't have to throw things," Mrs. Lee said sharply, but her voice was more hurt than angry. Sullivan watched as Washington listened to both of them, offering not just sympathy but practical suggestions. He knew about a job training program at the community center. He mentioned that Maria's grocery was hiring a manager. He even offered to watch their daughter Jenny for free at basketball practice so they could go to job interviews. Gradually, the tension in the room eased. Mr. Lee apologized to his wife. Mrs. Lee sat next to him, holding his hand. There would be no arrest today, no hospital visit, no complaint form to fill out. As they left the apartment 30 minutes later, Sullivan was unusually quiet. Washington waited, sensing his partner had something to say. 5 years ago, Sullivan finally spoke. "I got a similar call. Guy had lost his job too. But I went in hard, like I always did. Ended up taking him down in front of his kids when he wouldn't calm down. Thought I was doing my job, keeping everyone safe." They walked down the stairs slowly. "You know what happened to that family?" Sullivan continued. "They fell apart. Kids went into foster care for a while. Man lost custody rights. Wife moved away. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I was just enforcing the law." They reached the street, where the morning sun was now high overhead. "But today," Sullivan shook his head. "Today that family has a chance, because you saw them as people first, not just a situation to control." Washington smiled slightly. "That's all Captain Chen's been trying to tell us, you know. Sometimes the badge isn't the most powerful tool we have. Sometimes it's just being human." Sullivan nodded, thinking about how many situations in his career might have ended differently if he'd understood this earlier. "Come on," Washington said, checking his watch. "If we hurry, we can catch Maria before she sells out of tamales." As they walked, Sullivan realized something had changed inside him. The anger he'd carried for so long felt a little lighter. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to this new way of policing after all. "Hey, Washington," he said suddenly. "Think you could use another coach for that basketball program?" The afternoon sun beat down on Sullivan as he and Washington stopped at Kim's Vietnamese restaurant for their lunch break. Over the past month, Sullivan had gotten used to these stops at local businesses, though he'd never admit how much he enjoyed them. Come in, Mr. Kim called from behind the counter. His elderly father sat in the corner, as always, sipping tea and watching the small TV mounted on the wall. Washington headed straight for their usual table, but today, Mr. Kim waved Sullivan over to the counter. "Officer Sullivan, please, I need to show you something." Sullivan noticed the worry in the man's eyes. "Everything okay, Mr. Kim?" The restaurant owner pulled out a crumpled letter from under the counter. "Someone left this last night. Third one this week." His hand shook slightly as he handed it over. Sullivan read the poorly typed note demanding protection money. His first instinct was to launch a full investigation, maybe set up surveillance. The old Sullivan would have already been calling for backup. Instead, he asked quietly, "Why didn't you report this earlier?" Mr. Kim glanced at his father in the corner, then lowered his voice. "My father. He doesn't trust police. In Vietnam, before we came here, they were not like you and Officer Washington." Sullivan sat down at the counter, something he'd never done before. "Tell me about it." Mr. Kim seemed surprised by the request but pulled up a chair. As Washington handled some paperwork at their table, Mr. Kim shared his family's story. His father had been a respected teacher in Vietnam, but when war came, everything changed. They lost their home, their savings, their dignity. When they finally made it to America in 1975, they had nothing but hope and determination. "First few years were very hard," Mr. Kim explained. "No one would rent to us. My father cleaned toilets at night. I went to school during day, worked dishes here. This was different owner then, but we saved every penny." Sullivan found himself thinking about his own grandparents, who had fled Ireland during the potato famine. His grandfather's stories about signs reading, "No Irish need apply," suddenly felt closer to home. 15 years ago, Mr. Kim continued, "Old owner want to sell. My father took out every dollar from savings, borrowed from whole community. Everyone pitch in little bit. Now look." He gestured proudly around the restaurant. The elderly Mr. Kim was now teaching the young waitress how to properly fold napkins, his wrinkled hands moving with practiced grace. Despite not speaking much English, he had become a grandfather figure to many of the local kids who worked part-time at the restaurant. "You know," Sullivan said, "my grandfather used to say that being Irish meant you had to work twice as hard to get half as far." He surprised himself by sharing this. He never talked about his family history. Mr. Kim nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, yes, same for us. But America." He paused, searching for the right words. "America gives chance. Not always easy chance, but chance is there if you work hard." Washington joined them, having finished his paperwork. "Everything okay here?" Sullivan picked up the threatening letter. "No, but it will be. Mr. Kim, I'm going to need you to tell me everything you remember about when these letters started appearing." As Mr. Kim described the situations, Sullivan found himself taking notes differently than he used to. Instead of just recording facts for an investigation, he was seeing the whole picture, how this affected not just the business, but the entire community that had helped build it. "We'll increase patrols in this area," Sullivan said finally, "and I'd like to talk to some of the other business owners, see if they've received similar letters." Mr. Kim's relief was visible. "Thank you, Officer Sullivan. Please, lunch is on me today." "Not necessary, Mr. Kim," Sullivan replied, reaching for his wallet. "We protect our own in this neighborhood." As they ate their pho, Washington smiled at his partner. "Our own, huh?" Sullivan stirred his soup thoughtfully. "You know what I'm starting to realize, Washington? These folks, they're not so different from my own family. Different language, different food maybe, but same dreams, same struggles." "Took you long enough to figure that out," Washington teased. Sullivan watched as the elderly Mr. Kim taught another young worker how to greet customers properly, remembering how his own grandfather had taught him the importance of hard work and dignity. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but better late than never." The call came in at 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. Sullivan and Washington were just finishing their afternoon patrol when their radios crackled to life. "All units, possible hostage situation at the Community Youth Center. Suspect armed, multiple children inside." Sullivan's heart dropped. The youth center, where he'd been coaching basketball with Washington for the past few weeks. Today was art class day. There would be at least 20 kids inside. "This is Officers Sullivan and Washington. We're 2 minutes out." Washington responded, "Already running." Sullivan matched his pace, his mind racing with scenarios. When they arrived, they found a crowd gathering outside the center. Mrs. Martinez, who ran the after-school programs, rushed toward them in tears. "It's Kevin," she sobbed. "Kevin Miller, he has a gun. Says nobody understands him, nobody listens. He's got the children in the main room." Sullivan knew Kevin, a troubled 16-year-old who'd recently been kicked out of school. The old Sullivan would have charged in immediately, weapon drawn, but something made him pause. Last week at basketball practice, he said to Washington, Kevin mentioned his father was getting out of prison, said he was scared. More patrol cars arrived, sirens wailing. Captain Chen pulled up, quickly establishing a command center. SWAT was on their way. He knows us, Washington said urgently to Chen. Let us try talking to them first. Chen looked at Sullivan, who nodded. 5 minutes, she agreed. But if SWAT arrives, they take over. Sullivan and Washington approached the center's entrance slowly. Through the glass doors, they could see Kevin pacing, a small handgun shaking in his grip. The children sat huddled together on the floor, some crying quietly. Kevin? Sullivan called out, keeping his voice calm. It's Officer Sullivan. Officer Mike is here too. Can we talk? Stay back, Kevin shouted, his voice cracking. Nobody comes in. Okay, we'll stay right here, Sullivan responded. Remember last week at practice, you made that amazing three-pointer. Told me it was because your dad taught you how to shoot when you were little. Kevin's pacing slowed. He's coming back. Everyone says he's changed, but what if he hasn't? Washington spoke up. I know you're scared, Kevin. Change is hard. But look at Officer Sullivan here. Few months ago, everyone said he couldn't change either. Now he's coaching kids and making a real difference. Sullivan shot Washington a quick look, surprised by the comparison, but he saw Kevin listening. Your dad made mistakes, Kevin, Sullivan continued, taking a careful step forward. But right now, you're about to make an even bigger one. These kids trust you. Remember little Sarah? She shows everyone the art project you helped her with last week. Kevin glanced at the children, his hand trembling more. I just wanted someone to listen. We're listening now, Sullivan said softly, and we'll keep listening. But first, you need to let these kids go home to their families. Tears started rolling down Kevin's cheeks. You promise? You'll help me. I promise, Sullivan said firmly. You're part of our community, Kevin. We take care of our own, remember? The gun lowered slightly. Washington slowly opened the door while Sullivan kept talking. How about we start with some one-on-one? You've almost got that crossover move down. Just need a little more practice. Finally, Kevin's arm dropped completely. Washington moved quickly but calmly, securing the weapon while Sullivan guided the children out. As SWAT arrived, they found Kevin sitting on a bench, head in his hands, Sullivan's arm around his shoulders. Later, after the paperwork was done and Kevin was safely in custody, headed for counseling instead of jail, thanks to Captain Chen's intervention, Sullivan sat quietly in the locker room. You get good out there, Chen said, appearing in the doorway. The old Sullivan would have gone in shooting. The old Sullivan was an idiot, he replied, then added, Captain. Chen smiled. The old Sullivan was doing what he thought was right. The new Sullivan just found a better way. As Sullivan drove home that night, he passed the community center. The cleanup crew was already erasing any signs of the day's drama. Tomorrow, kids would return for their classes, their games, their art projects. And he would be there too, not just as a police officer, but as part of something bigger. A community that looked out for all its members, even the ones who lost their way sometimes. He remembered Kevin's face when he made that promise to help. It was the same look Mr. Kim had given him, the same trust Mrs. Martinez showed, the same hope he saw in the eyes of every person who called this neighborhood home. For the first time in his career, Sullivan felt like he was truly serving and protecting, not just enforcing the law, but building something worth protecting. The community center's main hall was packed for the monthly police advisory board meeting. Sullivan shifted uncomfortably in his chair near the back, unused to being in this room without his basketball shorts and whistle. Washington sat beside him, looking much more relaxed in his civilian clothes. Biggest turnout I've seen, Captain Chen remarked, taking the empty seat next to Sullivan. The room buzzed with conversation as community members filed in, shop owners, parents, teachers, and even some of the teenagers from the youth programs. Mr. Kim was there with his father, who now nodded at Sullivan with respect. Maria from the grocery store had brought her famous tamales. Even Kevin Miller's mother sat in the front row, her face showing both worry and hope for her son, who was now in a youth rehabilitation program. Mrs. Martinez stepped up to the microphone, calling the meeting to order. Tonight, we're here to discuss the changes we've seen in our neighborhood over the past few months. Sullivan prepared himself for complaints. These meetings usually meant listening to everything the police were doing wrong. He'd avoided them for years for that very reason. First, Mrs. Martinez continued. I'd like to talk about last week's incident at the youth center. Sullivan tensed, but she smiled. What could have been a tragedy became a moment that showed us what community policing really means. Several people nodded. A mother stood up, her young daughter clinging to her hand. My Sarah was there that day, she said, voice shaking slightly. And what I remember most wasn't the fear. It was Officer Sullivan talking to Kevin like he was a person who mattered, not just a threat to be eliminated. Sullivan felt his face growing warm as more people stood to speak. Mr. Lee, from the domestic disturbance call months ago, rose next. When Officers Sullivan and Washington came to our apartment, they didn't just stop a fight. They helped me find a new job. Now I'm managing Maria's grocery, and my daughter is in the youth basketball program. Maria herself chimed in from the back. Officer Sullivan used to just drive by in his patrol car. Now he knows everyone's names. He helps old Mrs. Chen carry her groceries. He shoots hoops with the kids. He's not just a police officer anymore. He's part of our family. Washington nudged Sullivan's arm, grinning. Look who's the community favorite now. Sullivan tried to brush it off, but he couldn't ignore the warmth spreading in his chest. He remembered how he felt about these people just a few months ago, the assumptions he'd made, the walls he'd built. Mr. Kim's father slowly stood up, and the room fell silent. Everyone knew he never spoke at these meetings. Through his son's translation, he said something in Vietnamese, his eyes fixed on Sullivan. Mr. Kim translated, his voice thick with emotion. My father says that in Vietnam, we learned to fear the police. Here, because of officers like Sullivan, our grandchildren learned to trust them. Captain Chen stood up. When I first came to this precinct, I saw two things: a neighborhood full of potential, and officers who needed to see that potential too. Officer Sullivan, she turned to face him, you've shown that change is possible, not just in how we police, but in how we connect with our community. Sullivan felt Washington nudge him. Realizing people were waiting for him to speak, he reluctantly made his way to the front of the room. Looking out at the faces he now knew, faces that belonged to people with stories he'd learned to hear, he cleared his throat. I'm not good at speeches, he started. For 20 years, I thought being a good cop meant being tough, showing strength. I was wrong. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Real strength is in listening, in understanding, in admitting when you need to change. He looked at Kevin's mother. It's in giving second chances. His eyes moved to Mr. Kim and his father. It's in learning from each other. Finally, he glanced at Washington and Chen, and it's in having partners who show you a better way. The applause that followed wasn't just polite. It was genuine, warm, like a family celebrating one of their own. Because that's what Sullivan had become, without even realizing it. A true part of this community he'd once viewed with suspicion. As people began mingling after the meeting, sharing food and stories, Sullivan watched it all with new eyes. He wasn't just observing his beat anymore. He was home. 6 months after Captain Chen first arrived at the 43rd Precinct, Sullivan stood in front of a fresh-faced rookie officer named Tommy Rodriguez. It was Sullivan's first day as a field training officer, a position he'd never imagined himself taking. First thing you need to know, Sullivan said, adjusting his badge, is that this job isn't what you think it is. He led the rookie out of the precinct, choosing to walk rather than take the patrol car. But sir, Rodriguez looked confused. I thought we'd be doing patrol in the car. Learning radio codes, arrest procedures. Sullivan smiled, remembering how he once thought the same way. We'll get to all that, but first, you need to meet your real teachers. Their first stop was Maria's grocery. The morning sun had just risen, and Maria was setting up her fruit display, just like she did every morning. Officer Sullivan, she called out cheerfully. And who's this handsome new officer? This is Rodriguez, Sullivan introduced. He thinks being a cop is all about catching bad guys. Maria, why don't you tell them about how you caught that shoplifter last month? Maria smiled, arranging her oranges. Ah, yes. Young boy, trying to steal food. Instead of calling the police right away, I asked him why. Turned out his little sister hadn't eaten in 2 days. Their mother lost her job. She looked at Rodriguez. You know what Officer Sullivan did? Rodriguez shook his head. He helped the mother find work at the community center. Now the boy volunteers here after school, earning his food honestly. Sometimes the best arrest is the one you don't make. They continued their walk, stopping at Kim's restaurant. Mr. Kim's father was teaching two teenagers how to make spring rolls, his weathered hands guiding theirs with patience. "See those kids?" Sullivan said quietly. "They used to run with gangs. Now they're learning a trade. Sometimes protection means more than just wearing a badge." Throughout the morning, Sullivan introduced Rodriguez to shop owners, families, and community leaders. At the youth center, they watched Washington coaching basketball, Kevin Miller among the players, now working as a peer mentor for younger kids. "Sir," Rodriguez said during a break, "this isn't what they taught us at the academy." Sullivan nodded. "The academy teaches you how to be a police officer. The community teaches you how to be a guardian. Took me 20 years to learn the difference." They stopped at the corner where Sullivan had first met Washington for their walking beat all those months ago. "You see this street?" Sullivan gestured around them. "I used to see threats everywhere. Now I see stories. Every person has one. Your job isn't just to protect them, it's to learn them." Captain Chen was waiting when they returned to the precinct. "How was the rookie's first day?" she asked, hiding a smile. "Didn't make a single arrest," Sullivan reported. "Didn't write a single ticket. Instead, he learned 17 names, 5 family histories, and 3 secret recipes." He turned to Rodriguez. "Tomorrow we'll start on procedures and protocols. But remember what you saw today. This is the foundation of everything we do." Rodriguez nodded, his perspective visibly changed. "I think I understand, sir. It's about building bridges, not walls." "Not bad, kid," Sullivan grinned. "Maybe you'll work out after all." Later that evening, as Sullivan prepared to head home, he found a note on his desk. It was from Captain Chen. "Remember when you said these programs would never work? Sometimes the biggest changes start with one person willing to grow. You become the change we needed in this precinct. Thank you." Sullivan tucked the note into his pocket and walked out into the evening air. The neighborhood was quiet but not silent. Music played from open windows, children laughed in the distance, shop owners called good night to each other as they closed up. He passed the spot where he'd once made his toughest arrests, now transformed into a community garden. Mr. Kim's father was there, teaching local kids how to plant vegetables. The elderly man waved, and Sullivan waved back, remembering a time when such a simple gesture would have seemed impossible. As he walked home, Sullivan reflected on his journey. He'd started as a cop who saw only problems to solve and people to control. Now, he was a guardian who saw potential, humanity, and hope. The racist cop who had once resisted change had become the change itself. And in changing, he'd helped transform not just himself, but his entire community. It wasn't always easy, and there was still work to be done. But now he knew the truth. Real strength wasn't in the power of authority, but in the power of understanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new chances to make a difference. And Officer Mike Sullivan would be ready, not with force, but with compassion, the most powerful tool on his belt.